huge thanks to CTO Craft sponsor partners for helping make these Bytes events possible. Partners like AWS, Google Cloud, O'Reilly, and Pentalog, amongst others. CTO Craft membership gives you access to some unique benefits from some of these partners, so click in the link in the chat to find out more. A big thank you to Jellyfish for partnering with us to organize this event in particular. So, nice to meet you, everyone. I'm Matthijs van Leeuwen. I'm a principal customer strategist at Jellyfish. Joining me today is Rob Malchon, CTO at Vestwell. Rob, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Why don't I start by sharing my slides, and I can go over a little bit about my history and all that. So hopefully this will not take too long and it will be technically effective. Otherwise, we're in a bad situation. So let's try it. Okay.
See your slides.
Okay, great. So well, let's just jump right to the chase and talk all about me. So I am the CTO here at Vestwell. Vestwell is a company based in the US, and our mission is to close the savings gap in the US. It's been increasingly widening over the years. We started by providing 401ks, essentially retirement vehicles for businesses, and then have expanded into funding and running IRAs, individual retirement accounts. We also do 529s and ABLE accounts, which are for folks who have disabled members in there. It's a tax advantage system for disabled members in your family. So essentially, we're here to help the US close the savings gap, which has been kind of a bad thing. I've been doing engineering management for over 20 years. Before that, I was actually an engineer. I was a Java engineer back in the time of Struts, if you all remember that. And I have a rich history of being misunderstood by other executives, and it's been somewhat of a challenge. So I want to share everything I know, and hopefully you won't make the same mistakes I did. So and there's my resume in black and white. But let's just jump right into it. So I'm going to start by talking about communicating to executives, and this is hopefully useful if you're an executive and even a technical executive, and also if not an executive. And then we're going to go into the things you really want the executives to understand about engineering and engineering value and what it brings to the company beside the obvious. And then lastly, I'll give you some tips on how to make sure you're in alignment with the rest of the company, and that what you're working on in the technology area is actually furthering the mission of your company and the goals of your company, right? So first off, so this is from a great blog called Irrational Exuberance. And he talks about how to craft your message to your audience. So in terms of communicating value, these are the things I would stress. There's essentially 4 different audiences: the CEO, who's your boss, right? And the board of directors, who's also your boss's boss, right? And then you have the finance team, CFO in particular. You have your strategic peers, and we'll define strategic peers as people who are sort of in the same boat as you. If you're in technology, this is basically product. And then you have your tactical peers, folks who don't directly contribute to the work you're doing, and their success isn't exactly part of what you're doing, but they benefit for the output of technology. So with the CEO, be definitive. Don't be wishy-washy. The board, they do not want to hear that this may happen, this may not, even though you were quite aware of the vagaries of some of these things. They want the problem taken care of. They want to hear that it's taken care of. Obviously, if it's not taken care of, it's a big risk or something like that, you have to raise that. But ambiguity is not your friend here. Finance, you need to be very precise and very tangible. Sometimes with your board, you need that too. It depends on the board, but you really want to talk about the costs and the benefits in dollars and cents. Your strategic peers and the tactical peers, I think, when you're talking about engineering value, in particular, I'm talking about engineering work that's not directly related to product delivery. Oh no. Sorry, I triggered Siri by some sentence there. But I would just say to emphasize the shared benefit, right? That's important. Now, I apologize. This is my first slide. The yellow will go away. I wish I had not chosen yellow at the beginning, or the gold. And let's go deeper into it.
And for our attendees, if you have any questions, there's a question Q&A panel on the side. Feel free to drop questions in there as we go through this presentation.
Yeah, and please, Matthias, clue me in when they're, because I'm not actually able to see.
I'll keep an eye on those.
Okay. All right. So this is for the execs and talking to execs. If you're not an execs are busy and they change contacts rapidly. Myself, I'm in meetings, half-hour meetings that can go from budget at one end to a technical problem on the other to an HR problem on the other. They don't have the luxury of spending 4 or 5 hours on something at once. Executives generally got into their place because they're good at pattern matching. That means they try to understand things by matching them to things in their own world. For me, if I'm talking to the CFO, he's trying to explain something, I try to turn it into technical terms in my own way. And executives generally are allergic to problems without solutions. It just comes off as complaining. You can have not the correct solution, or you could have multiple solutions, but give us options and choices. Don't expect us to necessarily solve it for you. So there's essentially 2 different ways that I see people communicate issues and problems. One, you take the problem, you talk about the impact, you talk about potential solutions, and then you get into the details, what the cost, the time, and the start, the end. This is a lot of how I see engineers communicating to engineers, engineers communicating to product. This is not necessarily the best way to talk to executives. There's a framework called BLUF, bottom line up front, and that's to do most important information first, then you give your supporting details, and then you do whatever other history you need to do. And the most important information is really what you're going to do and why it's important, straight up. You don't want to build that problem. And the reason is because of that pattern matching. Executives will try to go quickly, and so they will try to fit it into your see those problems and fit it into a solution off the bat, and you're going to get sideways and derailed. I remember one of the first times I presented to executive, I got about 5 minutes into it before he started asking very detailed questions about cost that I was not prepared to answer. And I got about 2 slides into the presentation. It was basically I was trying to get more money for a logging solution. That'll come up again. And he immediately shut me down. I got nowhere. So if I just said what I needed at the beginning, instead of trying to build my case, it would have gone a little bit better. What do the other executives generally want to know from R&D, from CTO? Well, they're basically, usually, will Project X be done on time? Why can't Project X be done sooner? Why can't Project X be done cheaper? And why is your team saying Project Y is impossible? All of those are questions you should be prepared to answer, especially Project Y. That's when you can get into trouble. I remember being asked that where I had sort of definitively said this project could not be done. Now, of course, every project can be done. It's not impossible. What I really meant, it was cost prohibitive. So a better way for me to present it would have been like, yeah, we can do it. It'll take $13 million and it'll take 4 years or whatever it would have been. And that would have shut it down because the expectation on that particular project was 6 months, get it done, we would make $2 million in revenue. And it was really upside down. And then the hardest question to answer, and one that is sort of ironic, is why do we have so much technical debt that is slowing us down? Technical debt is that word that has made it into everyone's lexicon at this point. I don't think it really has the same meaning now that it was intended to, which was the idea of sort of like a credit card. You spend your technical debt wisely. There's times you want to take it on where speed is more important than prettiness or sustainability. But you get that all the time from the execs. And what you really want to say is, because you're always pushing me to go faster and go to get these things done on time, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to be careful how you talk about technical debt because the implication is the technical debt is there because you have really bad engineers and you're bad at your job.
Cut corners. Yeah,
you cut corners. There's certain things you need other executives to understand. You need them to understand the difference between an estimate and a commitment. And you also need them to generally understand the inelasticity of capacity. I think everyone knows the estimate and commitment. I got stuck with one of those before, where it was a long project, like a 16-month project, and the original estimate was 16 months. And then when we got closer, as we moved along and realized it wasn't going to be 16 months, it's going to be more like 18 months, I started getting, sorry, my daughter. No. Sorry. The difference between an estimate commitment, again, is like when it started getting to 18 months, I started getting a lot of heat for having a bad estimate or bad commitment or missing my commitment. And it really wasn't actually that. It was just that it was such a large project, you can't be that precise at the beginning. And what I mean by the general elasticity of capacity is really two things: the fungibility of engineering in squads and the true cost of developer onboarding. Because a lot of time when we take on a project, especially if a project comes with revenue attached to it, you'll come up with some guess of how long it'll take, and how many engineers will work on it for how many people months, and that kind of figures out your pricing. And that's the first cut of it. But you really know that sometimes the work required will hit a particular engineering discipline, back end, front end, or a particular squad that owns a particular piece of business. And that is not necessarily fungible. So you can't just swap out. You can't just say, well, we have 3 squads, 2 of them are kind of idle. We can just add them to it, because it won't work. And then also they'll just say, okay, great. We just need 5 more people in engineering. Let's hire them, and then we can do this project. There is a pace to onboarding, as you all know. Developers don't come to your company, even if they are the most experienced, highest price, whatever, Scala engineer. They don't know your problem domain. They need to learn the way you do things. That takes time and money in the terms of reduced attention from the other engineers in the squad who have to take their time to onboard folks. And that's really something that people need to understand. We're going to get into the stuff that you want them to understand, but you do not need them to understand, and you really should keep to yourself. If you start talking about this, you're going to get not far. You're going to hit that brick wall. So development complexities, they don't want to hear it, right? The phenomenon of emergent requirements. Now, this is a big part of Agile, but it's something that I've seen where it really was an aha moment for me of like, oh, of course, as you get closer to the end, as you work on it, more things become apparent that you'll have to do. But for other executives who perhaps don't understand that nuance, they like to think of it as a train just hitting the stops on time. Probabilities and predictability. So I got into trouble with this because we were doing a project when the teams were doing Kanban. And Kanban, as you know, is not necessarily sprint-based. It's not necessarily schedule-based. You're pulling stuff in as you have capacity to work on it. And I looked at there's a tool and baked into Jira or something like that, looked into it and said, oh, we have an 87% of hitting July 1st as the date. The CEO rightly mocked me for that. That was not something he wanted to hear. The other thing you can't talk to other executives about is who to blame when things go wrong. This is very common. Product saying engineering's going too slow, engineering saying product keeps changing the requirements, or design keeps changing the design, or that the sales team didn't tell you the true product domain or the true number of customers. But who's to blame when things go wrong? It's you, right? That's you. You got to take it. And that's just something you gotta know. So these are things I wish I could beam directly into other executives' minds. I have not been able to explain these well. One is the true cost of too much work in progress. The myth, if you start earlier, you finish earlier. We can't, you hear it often expressed as, hey, we can't neglect this area of the business. We need to do all of these things now. I think, as you know, as technology folks, that there is a cost of juggling. We can't really multitask. It's not a real phenomenon. You start breaking your teams into smaller chunks. The one thing that I've seen that worked well, and albeit where it worked well for technology folks, was the coin game. The coin game was a game we were adopting a framework called SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework. And during the training, they had this game where you took a set of 10 coins and you had about 8 people. And the object of it was to have every person count all of the coins. And the way they had us do it is the first person count all 10 coins, pass to the next person, count all 10, blah, 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 and have a stopwatch going the whole process until the last person counted all of it. And we did that. Then the next thing is they said, okay, as soon as you count one, pass it to your person on the right and keep going. And of course, that method, which is limiting work in progress, was a lot faster. So.
Such an eye-opening exercise. I went through that one too. The coin game is awesome to really put that into perspective.
Yeah, I can't remember. It was like something from like 2 minutes and 30 seconds down to 30 seconds. And It really was cool. I've never tried it with other executives. Maybe I should. But kind of also harder to do in this remote world. Yeah. All right. Okay, now let's get to, we talked about talking to executives and non-technical executives. Let's talk about how you express the engineering value in business terms. In my I never got an MBO or MBA. I'm not a business person. I've never been in sales, but I think of the business as doing 2 things: making money and saving money, right? And making money, you're either adding new customers, you're growing your current customers, maybe by having them do more work with you, maybe raising your prices, and also you're retaining your current customers so they don't leave and you still have that money. Saving money, you're reducing current costs. Maybe you were able to get enough scale that AWS is going to give you a discount. You're avoiding future costs by thinking smart about your architecture and knowing that, hey, this is a single point of failure, or this isn't going to scale. Let's try a different technology than that Oracle database we had at the back end. And then also you're avoiding risks. Avoiding risk can be quality, right? If you have quality, you have problems. It can also be compliance. So I like to think of the 4 areas that engineering can really contribute to, and a good way to express the work you're actually doing is by that compliance. So not all businesses have a big deal of compliance. Here at Vestwell, we do, because we're dealing with people's money. So compliance, we get audited all that time. Being in a position where you're going to be able to pass those audits and you're going to be able to pass that audits without too much effort is a good way to save money. Cost reduction containment, I mentioned, right? Thinking ahead about what you could do. Do you need to go to the cloud? Do you need to take it back from the cloud? Do you need to switch tech stacks? Do you need to find what do they call it? Euphemistically, a center of excellence, meaning an offshore location to reduce costs? Do you need to spend more time improving quality? Because quality costs you both in not being able to move forward because you're working on those issues, and you generally get your customers quite irate when they keep having quality issues, and they will leave you, and you'll have a bad reputation, and it'll be really hard to get new customers. And then the hard one, increasing productivity. So increasing productivity is another one that can be sometimes hard to explain. Why do you want to spend time doing this optimization or building this internal tool for developers to go forward? And generally, the way that I find the best way to explain it is to talk about salaries and reduction in salaries. So, okay, this is going to make our people, not reduction in salaries, but people 15% more effective. You turn that in actual hard dollars, and people will listen to you, because over time that really adds up. Sense? Another thing is how you actually talk about the work you're going to do. So here's an example. We'll go from okay to good, right? And okay, we're kind of taking the typical agile epic story thing, right? As a DevOps engineer, I want to consolidate alerting platforms. You have multiple alerting platforms, you want to consolidate it. Okay, that tells you what you want to do and who wants to do it. It doesn't really talk about the benefit, right? Yeah, okay. As a DevOps engineer, I want to consolidate a learning platform so that it's easier to detect issues and we spend less time consolidating platforms. Oops, typo. Less time. Uh, what I really meant to write is less time.
Consolidating notifications and alerts.
Well, I was going to say less time responding to problems and fixing problems, right?
Right.
MTTR. So here's a better way. As a DevOps engineer, I want to consolidate a learning platform so it's easy to detect issues and we lower our MTTR and save $42K annually. That's what executives want to hear. They want to hear those dollars, right? And they want to hear, aside from the spelling of MTR, they want to hear or see something tangible that changes when you do your business value. And I think that's true for all product items, but it's when you're an engineer or an engineering manager or a CTO, you really want to put on your product hat and start talking the same way they do as benefit. It's not what you're going to do, it's why it's important, and more important, and most importantly, how it's going to affect the bottom line, right? Sorry if I'm going fast. I had a lot of coffee this morning. Here we go. All right. Another way about talking about engineering investment is to really sort of show your work, right? This is actually taken from Jellyfish. And I've seen it done other places. I once worked at a company which was acquired by a private equity group. And all of a sudden, they had the private equity group, our board became very different in what they wanted from engineering. So before, the board really wanted to know what are the cool new features, how are you attacking the market, all that stuff, what's getting released when. They didn't particularly ask about how we were actually spending our money. They might say, hey, you have an $11 million budget, how can we get that down for engineering? Or why is it so high, blah, blah, blah. But they didn't really pay attention to how we were spending the engineering budget. The private equity folks were a bit different. They forced us, well, they did force us, they asked us to break it down into sort of different areas. We've simplified it here at Vestwell, and now we talk about the product roadmap, work that is, basically pushing our products forward, getting new stuff, enhancing old stuff, what have you. Our technical roadmap, which those are things like that we talked about before for cost containment or developer efficiency. Another typo, maintenance, or KTLO, keeping the lights on, stuff you just kind of have to do because you have to do. So an example might be, the end of life for your Ubuntu image that you're using and you need to update it, just has to happen because Amazon stopped supporting it. Or interrupt work, which is stuff that comes in not on the roadmap, happens because, defect, happens because you need to support the business in other ways. It can even be stuff that's unsolicited or unforeseen customer requirements. The customer comes in, is threatening to quit, and you need to go do some specific customer work. And lastly, we talk about the other work, the work that just hasn't been categorized. We want to keep that as low as possible. That really talks to our hygiene of how we're keeping things in Jira and how it's reflected in Jellyfish. Now, I've seen it done elsewhere, and Jellyfish actually simplifies this a little bit. They talk about those first two things, the product roadmap and the technical roadmap, as growth. They talk about maintenance and KTLO as maintenance, and they talked about interrupt work and other in the same way. I like specifying product roadmap versus technical roadmap. The savvy board was always curious when that technical roadmap got too small, because they knew we were satisfying short-term gains by investing more in the product roadmap than long-term sustainability in the technical roadmap. They knew that if we were neglecting that, we wouldn't be ready for the next thing that comes along in 2 years, right? So that was really an eye-opening experience to have those questions be asked to me at the board, because I hadn't thought of that way, and it really is important. And there's always sort of this tension, is like, how do we get more tech debt scheduled and put on there? That tech debt really is sort of that technical roadmap, and you can use this as a pretty good way to show other executives, including product, that, hey, we're falling behind. We need to think about this. I know we have some deadlines. I know we have some can't move commitments, but we need to think about where we're going there. The other thing you can do in Jellyfish is to look, and you can do it this other way. So you don't need a Jellyfish to do it, but we would do this with story points and the squads we had at other companies I was at before sort of adopting a Jellyfish-like tool. You can talk about where your investment is. Now, a phenomenon, if you look at just your epics or even just your stories, you're going to lose the forest for the trees. So this is actually a view of just all the epics, the amount of time. You can't even really make any sense of what this is. The ledger that would appropriate this or would come with this would be thousands of epics long. That's fine. Epics are really for the squads, in my view. That's how they arrange their work. That's how they understand it. But it is too granular and too incomprehensible for other executives to get there. So what you really want to do is layer that up. I've seen it go into, I think Jira sort of suggests categories, and underneath categories you have initiatives, and then underneath initiatives you have epics. Categories, I haven't really found a ton of value there. They tend to be you want to use those for things that never change. For me, that's kind of supplanted by the idea of the product roadmap, the technical roadmap, etc. But initiatives are important because initiatives can be large enough that a non-technical executive will understand it. It's where you can express the true business value beyond just the epic that will really move the needle for the company. So I really strongly advocate for rolling up into initiatives. You'll get pushback sometimes, like, hey, why are we doing all this Jira fuddling? It's not getting the work done. And there's some truth to that, right? You can do some navel gazing on these metrics and not be fun. But if you want to present something comprehensible, and presenting something comprehensible is better than just try to get people taking your work for it. That's what I do. That's all I had. So here, thank you and questions, or maybe more precisely questions and thank you. I know I went quick. I think did it in a lot faster time than we want. But that's what I got.
No questions so far in the Q&A. Please either drop them in the Q&A or in the chat.
Don't tell me I was on mute the whole time. No. No.
I heard you, Rob. I heard you. So.
Yeah. Well, I can talk a little bit more about some of the things that I really, like some of the horror stories I've had. One of them was, how do I express it? I'm trying to change the story so I don't incriminate anyone. So story points. We talked about story points. Story points, if you remember, at the beginning of Agile, they are super dangerous. They were, I thought, great. When they first came out 10, 15 years ago, whatever it was, I remember adopting them using a tool called ScrumWorks, which I don't think exists anymore. It was a great way for squads to estimate what to put in their sprint. Yeah. And you still see squads taking on way too much. It was a way to limit work in progress in its own way, and also really make sure you weren't overloaded or underloaded. People really, really want to turn story points into time. Yep. People always also really want to turn time into money. So, interestingly, back, one of the great uses of story points for me early on was the way to turn that into capitalizable numbers for we were doing software capitalization at this company. And so I was keeping track of it. I was using that to, take the total cost of the team and sort of figure out of the capitalizable stuff, what percentage in that sprint was capitalizable. And, keeping in mind that the velocity per team, the amount of story points they get done changes over time quite drastically.
Yes.
Also, I was using this for a local measure, right? I wasn't comparing team A with team B. Team A may have gotten 50 story points done per sprint, and team B may have gotten 15. I was still using the same calculation to determine the cost for capitalization. At one point, since I had been extracting this from ScrumWorks and putting in a big database, I actually looked at start and end time for the stories and the story points to see, does a 13 calculate to 2 months using the Fibonacci sequence? Almost zero correlation to time, I found. And that was over like a 2.5 year period. And I was just like,
wow.
Oh, wow.
That's a good sample size too.
Yeah, it was. And it was like, it was completely unexpected. I really actually kind of thought in my own head that it would turn the size. Later, I went to a different company that was very, very hung up on the narrative that engineering is inefficient. We're going too slow. So what they wanted to use was story points, but across all squads. So directly comparing story points between the different teams.
Oof.
Nonsensical. I got very, very frustrated. I was not the CTO. I was head of engineering, effectively. And I didn't really understand the politics. So I screamed and yelled, acted a bit unprofessionally, called the idea stupid. I thought it was stupid. And lost a lot of political capital, lost a ton of capital. A lot of good work that I had done over the years I became a persona non grata because I didn't really understand the forces at work, and because I didn't really explain to them. Well, I tried to explain why it didn't make sense, but for whatever reason, story points and story points equals time, story points equals money, story points should be corrected across squads is a business thought that I wish I could work. It does not work.
Yeah.
And then the other thing about alignment that I will mention is repetition. So at another company, one of the big strategic goals for the company was moving off of on-prem and into the cloud. Now, there are a few reasons for this. It was a big growing business with a lot of data, and it was, every year we'd have to make that guess of how many sales we were going to get and we were going to get there, and we're going to have to buy those boxes, install them, whatever. So the elasticity of the cloud really was important. And so it was coming from the top. It was actually coming from the board. It wasn't coming from me, who wanted it to make it easier for the engineers to work or anything like that. It was coming from the cloud. From the very top. Nonetheless, and it was about a 6 to 8 month project, I think. It was not insignificant. We hired outside consultants. We worked heavily with AWS. We did a lot of stuff. But nonetheless, every planning cycle, every sprint, product managers would push back on the work required because almost every squad was touched by this. We didn't have the ability to just make, hey, team A is going to be moving everyone to the cloud, right? And that's generally what you'll find. Nonetheless, every time kept getting questions. I had a very, very determined VP of data engineering who was just going for it. But even then, he got tremendous pushback. I had to repeat it all the time. Probably created 15 different slide decks, all saying the same thing, but kind of slightly tweaked so I could present it again without people just thinking it's the same deck. And so I'd say that's important, repetition for achieving alignment. Yeah.
So one of the things you mentioned earlier, Rob, was the limiting of work in progress, which is one of my I think pet peeves is the right term for that. And you talked about things like engineering onboarding, which is often underestimated. How do you feel about context switching? Because that, I got into it. I got a good taste of context switching when I started working in a call center right after college. And in that case, I was context switching from the moment the phone rang to the moment the next phone call came in, because it was supporting different types of organizations, different customers, etc. When it comes to engineering, I found that context switching personally is even more detrimental. If you pull an engineer away to talk to a salesperson about a potential solution for a customer, once they get back, they're spending somewhere between 15 minutes to an hour just to get back to the point of code or the thought process that they were in.
Yeah.
What's your experience and feel about context switching?
Yeah, I think context switching is incredibly detrimental. I think it is probably the most detrimental thing. And it's hard because I mentioned before, executives are essentially trained to do that, right? They have to. It's almost like forced ADHD. And so when I started getting more and more, first a manager, then a VP, whatever, it's like that was my days by my schedule. Now I use a tool called Clockwise to try to block off focus time. It's not very effective, right? Because even then I have to switch. Even if I'm not having meetings, I have to do a lot of different tasks that are all done at the same time. But I am not a creator, right? Software engineers are creators. Right. They're looking at problems. It's like they're writing a book, right? And it just doesn't work. Like there's so much reset time, as you mentioned. And I think that the way people try to get around it is by saying, okay, sprint A, this developer is doing this story, which is part of this initiative or whatever. This developer is doing this, and this developer is doing that. So they try to split the squad into individual developers, which kind of makes you think like, well, why do you have a squad in the first place, right? Usually it's because it's shared QA. And then the end result, you'll have a QA bottleneck, right? And it's really hard. I think even engineers don't like the idea of like, hey, you three engineers are all going to work on the same epic, because engineers like to work alone, right? It's a little bit easier, right? You don't have to worry about other people's time, but you lose that sharing of knowledge, right? So that you don't have a single point of failure. Two, hey, have you thought about that whole questioning, right?
Yeah.
I've never been in an organization that really adopted and loved pair programming or what's the new one, group program, swarm program, I forget what it's called.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the way around it to do it. But what we've done here, my VP of engineering, Scott Duncan, came up with a modified Kanban. He calls it Fight Club, and it's essentially the same as Kanban in terms of like you limited the different stages, but you have a limit of coming in with just one epic, right? So you just focus on that. Well, maybe it's a little bit bigger than epic, but it's like, for us, it's like processing incoming payrolls would be an example, or something like that, where it's like that's all you're thinking about. You're not trying to do that and correction tooling, and that the squads are a little bit smaller than traditional Kanban or Scrum teams. You're not doing the 2 pizza team, you're doing the 1 pizza team. But it's been really effective, and that's a good gate. But otherwise, you just see that turning a team of 4 developers into essentially 4 teams, right? Working on 4 different things at once.
Right.
And that's hard. And like I said before, everyone thinks the sooner you start, the sooner you get it done, right? Like, the deadline's in 6 weeks, you should start working on it. Maybe not, right? Maybe you should wait until you have the time, or your plate is clean. Really, is the idea.
Nice.
I don't know if anyone disagrees with that. I should say something really controversial to
let's see if people are paying attention.
Still paying attention, right? Engineers should work on paper and pen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Agile doesn't work.
I think
no responses.
No responses. I think there may be some truth to some of that. I think some ways that Agile has been, certainly like some of the Scrum and things like that, have been perverted over time, and that they're more detrimental than not. And in fact, really one of the reasons we moved to the Fight Club methodology is to reduce the meetings. We had nice. Grooming meetings, we had kickoff meetings, we had retro meetings, we had so many meetings. It is exactly what you talked about, interrupting the engineers and interrupting the tech leads to prep with the product managers. So I think there is a thing they used to call it Scrum smells, but there are just definitely ways that it can work against you.
Oh, yes. Yes. I've worked with organizations where Agile was an excuse for no governance and or no adherence to process or whatnot. No, we're Agile, so we don't need process. So even
that's another piece of advice.
I've seen it go both ways.
because Agile, usually a lot of people mean Agile is like, okay, we have this, self-governing team, this self-organizing team. They can chart their own roadmap. They can choose their own direction. And that kind of does work when you're small, right? Like that's very efficient when you're small, where you don't have overlap between squads, or you don't have a large shared service that might be a bottleneck to DevOps or whatever, QA, however you've organized. But once you start getting to a lot of overlap, you need to coordinate. At a company I was at before, that was exactly the case. Two teams would be working on something. One team would abandon their piece of it because something more important came up. The other team kept going and be like, oh, what do you mean? We're done now. You're not ready? And it's like, no, we changed our mind. And actually, the CTO came in, brought in SAFe and scaled Agile framework. And some things that are good, some things are bad about SAFe, but alignment was achieved. So
that makes sense. I got SAFe certified in a former life, so I enjoy a lot of pieces about that. I think there's a bunch of good things. There's also things that are less useful to implement in my book, but as a whole, as a methodology, I think specifically for larger organizations where you have to coordinate things, with these agile teams to come together as one solution. I think the skilled agile framework is one of the better ones out there to really create that cross team, cross squad coordination and ensure that your cadences meet up together and things are brought to life with as minimum bottlenecks as possible.
Yeah. What it might take? Well, I see Phil's question. Let me answer that real quick. So so I'm not against story points. I do not hate story points. I actually think story points are quite good. That they can just be perverted by the rest of the business. So story points, I think are good. And actually, one of the cool things if you're using Jellyfish is it can show you the story points that have been carried over for multiple sprints. Because again, remember the idea of story points was to put enough work that you get everything done at your end of your sprint, 2 week, 1 week, whatever it is. And so one of the best practices I think is somewhat forgotten is that, like, let's say your story, you said we can do 30 story points this sprint. You only get 20 done. What should you do? Should you plan for 30 story points the next time? No, you should plan for 20.
Plan for 20.
And no one wants to do that. So it goes to work in progress. Again, you just have these carry-on stories that keep going. So I actually really like story points, but you got to really explain how they're being used and make sure they're not being corrupted for the larger organization. But going back to one thing I'll say about not SAFe in particular, but I think frameworks in general, like SAFe or whatever other one, fill in the blank, are actually quite useful if you cannot get any agreement on how things should work, right? It's like product thinks this, finance thinks this, technology thinks this. We want to do it this way, we want to do it this way. You're not getting any agreement. Adopt a framework. Now, there's a high cost for adopting these frameworks. Generally, you have to train up, whatever. But it can be a way to break the ties. Like, okay, let's just do it by their book. And what you'll do is you'll take SAFe or whatever it is, and over time, and you'll do it by the book for the first couple of times, and then you'll sort of start tweaking it to your own way. What we found is like we tweaked it out of existence in the company I was using it, but I do think frameworks are useful in that way because they have the training, they have the rules written down. You have to come up with your own. You don't have to debate about it. It's just that's the way it's done. But I think the most important thing, and the thing that the CTO brought it in, was a genius. He got the executive team to buy into it before he even presented it to the technology team, which was awesome. He had magic powers. So that's another great way to do alignment, is do it from the top down. Otherwise, you'll get slings and arrows from every direction.
Yeah, I definitely think that getting an executive support is so key to these. I mean, going for something like Skilled Agile Framework is what a true digital transformation. Every piece of the engineering team will be touched by that if you do it right. And so getting buy-in up front from the whole executive team and getting them understanding what it is and why is so crucial to a successful rollout.
Yeah, and it's also it's a whole body exercise, right? Because whether it's the operations team or whoever makes requests into product, et cetera, they have to adopt the way they think, and they have to buy into it. So that's why it's really important.
Great.
Now, I'm not putting. I have mixed feelings about safe, but I do think any framework can work, right? Almost any framework.
Yeah. Agreed.
Maybe not some old-fashioned waterfall thing, but who knows?
I always joke that safe is just Scrum with a layer of waterfall on top.
That's true.
That was tell the safe folks.
Yeah, yeah. In some ways, a lot of these are all these frameworks are collections of known best practices, just kind of packaged, right, with a layer of money making on top of it. So, but they have value, right? They do have value.
For true.
For true.
Yeah. All right. So you can connect with our speaker after this event by the links I've shared in the chat. They'll be dropping in there shortly. The next event in the diary is happening on Wednesday, July 5th. This will be our first ever in-person event taking place in Manchester. Come with an open mind to network with like-minded CTOs in a relaxed social setting and chat about important tech topics and trends in an interactive evening. Swap business and personal development stories with community members and meet other CTOs based in Manchester. This event was made possible with the help of CTO Craft advocates, Dave McKernell and Rob Bowley. The event page has been posted in the chat and hope to see you there. Have a great rest of your week, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today.
Peace.
Thanks Rob.
Everyone.